Hello. Hello. Every time I turn on the camera, I forget how to speak English. Okay, welcome to another video. This is my third video on radical love. The first video was about radical love for the self. So, really, completely and utterly loving every part of your being. And the second video was about how that self-love can then translate to radical love for everyone else. Oh, churro. um, and today's video is about radical love in Sri Lanka. They say to turn up as the person who you want to be, right? They say to show up as the person you aspire to be. And so I am showing up as an advocate for radical love / clown. I'm also drinking coffee out of a bowl, you guys. All convention has gone out the window in my life right now. Okie dokie. Here we go. I was born in Sri Lanka, and that has been super significant in my life in general. And I'll talk a little bit about my own story today. But first, a little history lesson about Sri Lanka. I'm not going to go all the way back. I'm not going to go back thousands and thousands of years. That will come in future videos. But today, I'm going to talk about the history in Sri Lanka that I think is relevant or most relevant to the social problems in Sri Lanka today, right? The stuff that is important to talk about and be aware of. I want to talk about colonization, right? This is like, I'm going to be the girl, the colonization girl. I'm going to be the colonialism girl because there's this meme that's like always ready to ruin the vibes by talking about colonialism. And that's definitely me because even though I bring good vibes, every now and then I'll ruin my own good vibes by talking about colonialism. But I think it's important, okay? So I think we need to make room for it. I also want to preface everything I'm about to say by saying that I don't feel negatively towards anyone or any group of people because I've definitely been accused of being anti-white before. I've definitely been accused of not liking white people, which is not true, right? That is completely untrue. Some of my best friends are white. I'm definitely not anti-white. I'm definitely not against white people or white people being in Sri Lanka or none of that. Okay, so that said, let's talk about white people in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was first colonized by the Portuguese about 500 years ago, then the Dutch, then the British, and the British left in 1948, which is when Sri Lanka got its independence. During the British era, and I'm going to keep it fairly short, there's obviously loads to say about that. We talk about colonialism as if it's like, you know, people came and they plundered and they left, but actually there's a lot of nuance, there's loads and loads of stuff that happened, it's very complex. But for the purpose of today's video, I'm going to leave it there. During the British era, the British did their classic divide and conquer thing, right? They did that in so many countries around the world, and Sri Lanka was no exception. So what the British did was they divided the majority Sinhalese people and the minority, the large minority of Tamil people. And they essentially gave Tamil people the better jobs in administrative roles because they had a better proficiency of English. And so the British did their thing. They did their divide and conquer like they did everywhere. And so that was one of the reasons why there was this huge rift between Tamil people and Sinhalese people, was kind of born out of the colonial era. After the British left, the majority Sinhalese took over charge of the island. And of course, at this point, they're feeling pretty resentful that they were kind of the second-class citizens during the British reign. And so when the Sinhalese majority took up government, and the government was mostly made of Sinhalese people, they essentially overcompensated and tried to get Sri Lanka to be this Sinhalese island again, including they kind of merged this idea that when you're Sinhalese, you're Buddhist. And so it became this Sinhala Buddhist nationalism became like a thing. So then they started to institutionalize discrimination against Tamil people. For example, they passed something called the Sinhala Only Act in 1956, which made Sinhalese, the official language of Sri Lanka, and made everything else kind of the unofficial language, right? English and Tamil and stuff like that. And so this act was just one of many examples of ways in which Tamil people were marginalized in Sri Lanka politically and economically and culturally. Once the Sinhalese had taken charge, or the Sri Lankan government, but the Sri Lankan government was mostly made of Sinhalese people, and so it mostly served Sinhalese people. And so resentment started to grow on the Tamil side of things. As Tamil people, who live mostly in the north and east of Sri Lanka, they started to feel resentful towards the Sinhalese majority. So the Tamil people, they built resentment. And so in the 60s, 70s, 80s, all this resentment started to build up. And there was a group that formed, a guerrilla rebel group that took up arms called the LTTE, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. So whenever I talk about the LTTE, I feel a little bit fearful about how I speak about the LTTE because there's nuance, right? There's so much more to this than just good guys and bad guys. There's always nuance in these conversations, and that's kind of what I'm trying to open up here on this channel, in this video, is rather than saying the LTTE is good or bad, talk about why the LTTE exists in the first place, why they did the things that they did. The LTTE, it's in the name, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. Eelam is the Tamil word for Sri Lanka. So these are Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. The Sinhalese, Singha means lion. So the Sinhalese are like the people of the lion, people of the lions, I guess. And so the Tamils decided that the opposite of a lion is a tiger, and so they are the Tamil Tigers. So this is a group that was born out of the necessity to liberate Tamil people, because Tamil people had been trying to get their equality through conventional means, right? Politically, they'd been trying to find their equality through the institutions, but they weren't able to do that. And so as a response to this non-action from the Sri Lankan government, the LTTE was born. Because what else are you supposed to do? If you are a marginalized community and the government isn't listening to you, what else are marginalized communities supposed to do? And of course, this is sounding familiar to many of you now that we know what's going on in Israel-Palestine, for example. But this is the same situation that we see all over the world. We see marginalized groups take up arms because what else are they supposed to do? How are they supposed to find their liberation through words or through diplomacy when those in power are not listening? Tamil political leaders really tried to get Tamil people's rights through policy, through government, but they were unheard over and over again, consistently ignored by the powers that be in Sri Lanka. So the LTTE is a resistance group that came after a long period of oppression, of being ignored, and after a long period of erasure. If you are Sinhalese watching this, this might be a perspective that you've never heard before. If you're Tamil watching this, this might be a perspective you've not heard before. Because the other thing I'll say about the LTTE is that they are a violent group and they have committed many crimes. They have been responsible for the killing of many innocent people. And so this is what I mean by needing nuance in this conversation. It's not that the LTTE are just good or just bad. Are they necessary? The Tamil Liberation Movement grew as an ideology. And in 1983, there was a big event, and this is known as Black July in Sri Lanka, where 13 Sri Lankan soldiers who were stationed up in the north, where there's Tamil people living there, were killed by the LTTE. The killing of the 13 soldiers set in motion a sequence of events called the Black July riots. Violent mobs of Sinhalese people murdered thousands of Tamils and destroyed and set fire to Tamil people's homes, businesses, and even temples. A state-sponsored pogrom of thousands of Tamils. There are also reports of police arresting Tamils and handing them over to mobs, further showing the complicity of the authorities. An estimated 150,000 Tamils were forced to leave their homes and became refugees in their own country. As you can imagine, these awful events deepened the divide between the Tamil and Sinhalese communities. It had been generally a peaceful island in terms of like armed violence, stuff like that. It wasn't really heard of that much. And so for something this big to happen was a huge deal in Sri Lanka. It's only a small tropical island, right? There wasn't so many weapons, and all that stuff came after colonialism. There was a sequence of events that led to the Sri Lankan Civil War between 1983 and 2009. I'm going to pause just for a second because I can feel in myself, my heart is hammering in my chest, and it's not because I'm on my third coffee, although that could be something to do with it. But it's because making these videos has been something that I have sat on for a really long time. I've been talking about this stuff since I could speak, since I understood the concept of being half Tamil and half Sinhalese, since I understood war, since I understood what my parents went through when they left Sri Lanka and all of the mayhem that ensued. I've been talking about this for a long time, and just not publicly. Just not publicly. I've been talking about this in private, mostly with my parents, mostly at home, mostly through a filter of fear, because speaking up is something that is very alien to Sri Lankans, I think, in general. I think we have, as a group, I think Sri Lankans have gone through so much. Like, I'm not even just talking about colonialism, I'm talking about the war. So yeah, so I just wanted to just let you know that it is genuinely difficult for me to make these videos. It's something that feels very good for me to be speaking about this finally. So please do give the video a like, show some appreciation, because it's always encouraging for me, because then I can make more future videos. Yeah, thank you so much as well for everyone who has been so supportive so far. I've been really grateful for all of the support, especially those guys on Instagram. Like, there's a few people who've been so supportive on Instagram. They're always liking my videos and liking my stories. And yeah, I really appreciate that. Okay, continuing on with the story, that's a little bit about the history of Sri Lanka and why the LTTE exists in the first place. My father is Tamil. He is from Jaffna. And my mum is Sinhalese, and she is from Matra in the south. So they couldn't have been born further from each other on the island, quite honestly. And they met in the late 80s during the war, and they got married in 1990 during the war. And then they had me 1 year later in 1991 during the war. So I don't think I fully comprehended everything that happened there until recently. And being born in that kind of situation is also something that I think people don't quite understand. It's something that I didn't even know was trauma, right? It's one of those things you like look back on it and you're like, oh, right, that was trauma. Yeah, it really was kind of traumatic that they went through that and that I was born there, and then everything that ensued since then. So we don't often give it the credit it deserves, the heaviness of this weight that they had to carry with them from Sri Lanka into the rest of their lives. And this is not just our family, this is the story of the Sri Lankan diaspora, especially Tamil people in Sri Lanka. So that's where my personal story begins. In Sri Lanka in 1991. I was born in a hospital, and actually I met someone who was online. I met someone online who is now one of my good friends, who was born at the same hospital 1 day before me. And I'll tell you that story another time. I won't go into all of the details about what my parents went through in this video, but just know they left Sri Lanka 1 year after I was born. So I was 1 year old when we left Sri Lanka. And they went and sought refuge in France as asylum seekers. They couldn't get refugee status, so they couldn't get the documentation in France for some reason. There is something interesting about our parents' lives before we were born or before we were old enough to understand what they were doing. And we don't always need to know all of the details of our parents' lives. So they have their own privacy, they have their own lives. But they were in France seeking asylum with a 1 year old. And then when I was 4, and then they couldn't get asylum in France, so they moved to the Netherlands. So I was in the Netherlands between the age of 4 and 10. So I grew up as a Dutch kid, speaking Dutch as my first language. Moved to the UK when I was 10, couldn't speak English, so I started learning English when I was 10 in year 6 in the UK. And yeah, just had to kind of keep learning new languages as I was moving through the world as a child. I mean, looking back, you think, what a lot to go through as a child, right? To go from one place to another place to another place. I'm fairly adaptable as a person and I pick up languages quite quickly. And I think that's probably to do with my past, right? So we moved to the UK, where I grew up as a British Sri Lankan girl. So that's my story of how we ended up in the UK. And there's a lot of talk at the moment about immigration into Europe from the rest of the world, especially immigration to the UK. Immigration has become this huge topic again. And I want to point you to a video I did on immigration to Europe. You can click on that and watch that because I explain why so many people end up moving to Europe from the global south. Remember, colonialism had this massive impact on the rest of the world, and somehow people are like, well, that's in the past. All these immigrants are a problem. We've got to send them away. But actually, they're there for a reason, right? Colonialism might be in the past, but the impact of colonialism is very much present today. One thing as well, my parents being Sinhalese and Tamil meant that they were ostracized from both communities, right? So you can already see kind of the complexity of the identity I've got, right? I've got this like Sri Lankan identity, sure. But then within that, you've got the complexity of the half Tamil, half Sinhalese. And then you've got the French, little bit of French, and then the Dutch with the Dutch passport that I still have, and then the British identity as well. And so you can see that my own identity, and I don't want this channel to just be about me, by the way, but this identity that I embody with all these different nuances and perspectives means that I have an insight into the world that is very different from lots of people. And I find it very hard to relate to anyone who's super patriotic, for example. I don't feel patriotic as such. You know, I care about Sri Lanka and Sri Lankans, and I care about British people. I care about Dutch people. I have this kind of connection to these countries. At the same time, I don't think any one of those countries is better than any other country. I don't think like that about any country in the world. Countries are just kind of there. We happen to be born in a certain country. There's not much choice in that. So patriotism has always been such an alien concept to me. So because my parents are from either side, we were kind of ostracized from both sides, right? The Sinhalese community, my dad felt alienated. In the Tamil community, my mum felt alienated. And I didn't quite fit into either of those as well. And so I grew up very much shrunken. Like I grew up like in the Sinhalese community, I couldn't fully be myself because I had the Tamil side and couldn't fully express that. On the Tamil side, I have the Sinhalese part of my identity and I can't fully express that. And as I've gotten older, I've learned to just embrace all of the parts of my identity. And I have this like full, rich, complex identity, and I love it. It gives me such an interesting perspective into the world, and I hope to share that with you. So yeah, so I grew up on the junction of many different groups and identities. Your identity is a really interesting thing to explore, and I would love to encourage people to explore your identity, go inwards and really figure out who you are, because the more you know yourself, the more you can relate to other people because you're so comfortable in your own skin. So on top of the fact that I grew up in all these countries, I've also been traveling for the last 7 years all over the place, like Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, North America. And so I've seen quite a bit of the world now in various contexts. And so I feel like I have a pretty global perspective now. Anyway, I say all this because having had all of these experiences is why I have the worldview that I do. And the worldview is one of radical love. And we've come full circle. So my parents showed radical love when they married against everybody's wishes, when they married each other in a radical and revolutionary act of love in Sri Lanka during the war. And we've come full circle because I now embody radical love. And that's what I encourage people to do here. So this video is for Sri Lankans, right? It's for Sinhalese people, it's for Tamil people, and for all the other minorities in Sri Lanka. I haven't forgotten about you, all right? Burghers, Moors, Malays, the Kafirs, the Veddo. We mentioned them. Me and DJ Mass had a really interesting conversation about Sri Lanka. You can watch that right here too. And I haven't forgotten about you guys, right? I truly believe Sri Lanka has the capacity to be this beautiful island without social conflict, as long as we can all learn to heal our own traumas. Because let's face it, every single Sri Lankan I've ever met has been heavily traumatized by either colonial trauma or war trauma, or almost always both. And we've never really had a chance to heal from that. And so I think it's time to usher in a new era for Sri Lanka, one of radical love, one where we put behind us all of the divisions between all the different people in Sri Lanka, and we start accepting each other for who we are. We start embracing each other's cultures. Sri Lanka has so much potential to be this beautiful, peaceful, tropical paradise, but we need to heal collectively from all of the trauma that has been put onto us by first colonizers and then what we did to each other on the island. There is so much shame in Sri Lanka as well. The shame wound is huge in Sri Lankans. Most Sri Lankans feel some type of shame about who they are, what they've done, what they're doing. There's all this shame, right? And we need to get rid of that. There is no need for shame. So if you want to be part of this new era in Sri Lanka, click subscribe right now, because I'm going to be making more videos about this. I'll be doing a separate video about so-called expats in Sri Lanka. I'll do a separate video about that as well, and how we can use this idea of radical love and how that fits in with the expat community in Sri Lanka. But I really want Sri Lankans of all types to start feeling empowered in their Sri Lankanness. Sri Lanka is a beautiful, holy island, and we can all do our part to make sure that Sri Lankans feel at home in Sri Lanka. I will be doing future videos about how I managed to heal a lot of my own trauma, and in the hope that it's going to help you heal your trauma as well. It's time. It's time for us to heal. And it's time for us to feel empowered and take ownership of the future of the island. And the last thing I have written here, I want to end this by reading this last little bit. The divisions are a remnant of colonialism, and the more we look inwards and heal the parts of ourselves that are in pain or feel shame, the more we can love ourselves and extend that love to others. I am so excited to have found my voice and to be able to make these videos so without crying. Because I used to not be able to talk about this stuff without bursting into tears, because it was so painful to talk about. Whereas now I can kind of keep it together and talk about it. So it's time. I'm so grateful for everyone who's been watching these videos. Please give the video a like. Remember to embody love for yourself and for everyone else. I'll see you in the next video.